Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's really nice to share information and share some of our knowledge in Backbase. Today, I'm going to talk about test containers and how we are using that library in our acceptance tests. And let me talk a little bit about myself. I'm Fredy Sierra. I am backend developer, and currently I'm working for Backbase. I am from Colombia. I have 14 years of experience working with Java technologies. And 8 years ago, I decided that I like to travel and meet new people. So I decided to move first to Costa Rica. There I worked for 3 years. I met some of my best friends there. And then I moved to Amsterdam, and that's where I am working 3 years and a half working for Backbase. A little bit about Backbase. We already mentioned something, but in general, what Backbase is a platform to accelerate the digital transformation of the banks. You can see some of the names of those banks there. There are more than 100 at the moment banks working with our product. And we are leaders in the market, more than 1,000 people working for us. And 50% of that people is working in the product, in R&D, developing the product. We have partners around the world implemented this product for us. But what is the product? I like this slide. Is probably the most general way that we can see our product is that is this layer between the bank system, the core bank, and the customer of the bank. So what we offer is not a core banking, is something on the top of that. And we can do being there is offering nice interfaces, an omni-channel experience for the user. And we do that not just with beautiful front end, but also we have our own services. We have our own backend with the latest of the technologies, because we like to work with cool technologies. And we work with a microservice architecture inside that orchestration hub that you guys see there. So that's it for Backbase. What is Backbase? And I told you that I'm from Colombia. I grew up there. And I grew up with soap operas, with a lot of drama and a lot of stories. So I wanted to tell this story. Is the story of how in Backbase we fall in love with test containers. So back in the day, we were a team, the team Shadow, and we were in charge of these components, microservices components. If you are familiar with that architecture, you can be familiar with these names like the gateway, the registry. And something really nice about working with Backbase is that we try to implement new technologies as soon as we can, but that gives some disadvantages. For example, 3 years ago, we decided to go with Soul Netflix for our gateway, but wasn't ready. So we decided to take it, fork it, and add our own stuff. We did the same for the registry, for example. It was a new recon. We put some things on the top of that. And we have our own authentication providers, token converter, things like that. So this team was in charge of those really technical and really complicated and technical components. And our daily work 3 years ago or 2 years ago was really hectic. Every time we had issues and a lot of support. As an example, a normal day for us was something like that, like a client asking us something like, do you have queue rotation for asymmetric keys? When someone asks us something like that, the first thing that we do is to, okay, let me see the documentation to see if we support that thing. Well, it looks like we support it. So let me check the code. And in the code is it looks like it's okay. But then you said, okay, let me test your scenario. And then is when you have this moment of, oops, we have a problem. So you are really pissed because you have a problem with your code. And on the top of that, it comes this annoying question that a manager can make to you, right? Like, why don't you test those cases? I hate that question personally. And the first reaction from yourself is anger, because yeah, obviously you want to test all the cases. Obviously you care about the code, but yeah, sometimes things happen, right? So after you come a little bit, you start to think a little bit about what happened. Where is my problem? My problem is in my unit test. My problem is in my integration test. My problem maybe is in my acceptance test. To give you a little bit of concept, I want to show you what is the normal flow of these components. If you are familiar with the microservice architecture, you know that the entry point of this architecture is the gateway. And in Backbase, we have an interesting concept that is having an external token that is the authentication token from the bank. And we have an internal one that is just for services in the product, Backbase product. So a normal flow with these components is the user login with the authentication provider, and with the authentication provider provides an external token. So if the user wants to access a specific service like payments, the user just call payments with that external token, but the gateway, before sending the request to the payment service, what it does is having a conversation, and a small conversation with the token converter, and converts that external token to an internal one. And later, after you have the internal one, the gateway sends the request automatically to the downstream service, in this case, payments, for example. As you can see, the flow is really simple. This is not like payments where the user can interact with that capability, we call it, like that functionality payments in different ways, or with the transactions view of a client. You can interact, you can order your transactions in different ways, search. There are a lot of flows, but for us, it's really simple. So you might ask, why having a simple flow like this, why do you guys have so many problems? And the answer is that maybe the flow is really simple, but if you are familiar with these kind of components, the problem is that we have, you can configure a gateway in many ways. The same for an authentication provider. You can configure it in different ways. So we started to see that our unit tests were okay, our integration tests, integration tests, this test that we do with the component inside, for example, gateway, but without the dependencies, without other services. We just mock them. So for those tests, we were okay, but we had another kind of test that we called acceptance test, where we have all the components together. So let's have a look at the first version of those acceptance tests. So what we found is that this is the configuration for our acceptance test. So we have something really simple. We have a Helm file, and with the Helm file and that configuration, we just deploy an environment there. And once the environment is up and running, we just run our test. And those tests were running with REST Assure and HTTP call to that environment, and that's it. When we saw this, we figured out that we were just running this acceptance test against kind of the default configuration. But I mentioned to you that we can configure the product in different ways. That was the issue. So we realized that we needed another set of these ones, but with another configuration. Let's say like the case that I mentioned to you, like the asynchronous keys And in that case, we needed another file with another configuration to deploy another environment and run our tests on the top of that. But then we realized that we don't have 1, 2, 3, 4 scenarios, but we have more. We have more different ways to configure the product. And obviously, for those different ways of configuration, you need to test those environments in a different way. Having this configuration, the environment variable in one side and the testing in the other, is really difficult. Even for 4 scenarios, you don't have a framework to organize those configurations, right? Another disadvantage is that if you want to understand what you are testing, you have to read the test itself and also the configuration, the Helm file, if you want to understand what is happening there. Otherwise, you don't know what you are testing, right? And another problem that we had is that for some cases, we wanted to have the control of the environment from the test itself. In some cases, especially for resilience tests, we wanted to control, like if the service was up and running, maybe we wanted to stop the service to verify that the response was expected for us. So we couldn't have those scenarios. We had to cover those scenarios like manually, which doesn't make sense. For us, if it's not automated, well, the test it doesn't exist, right? So we were in a difficult situation all the time on support. And on the top of that, managers realized that it's time to move. We need another gateway. For us, it's like a big news because we can implement it with new tools. However, they wanted to have this backward compatible. And for us, we didn't even know what we had because we didn't have tests. So we were kind of sad and worried about what will happen for us. So this is part of the soap opera where everybody cries and we didn't know what to do. And you know how soap operas work. In this moment is when we met TestContainers. Someone talked about TestContainers, and maybe you know or heard about it, but basically it's a way to control your Docker containers, but using Java. I wanted to describe what is the use, like the classic use of TestContainers, and the way that we use it in the company. People use it as a data access layer integration test. In general, if you want to test your data access objects, what you do is maybe use H2 as a database, but the disadvantage of this approach is that H2 is really limited, doesn't have the same features that a database like Oracle or MySQL will have. And the other approach is to have a real database, but in another machine or on a virtual machine, and your test in another place. But with that approach, the problem is that the life cycle of both is different, meaning you can have an inconsistent scenarios all the time, right? Maybe the database is not clean enough before you run your test, those cases. So TestContainers offers a great solution for that. You can use these JDBC URL schemes. So in a scenario where you will use a JDBC address to connect to a database, you can just change that URL to token converter TC, the name of the database, or the name of the container that you want to instantiate. And if you have TestContainers in your dependencies, TestContainers will automatically create a container for you to handle those requests by magic. So that's the way that we do it in Backbase because our product supports 4 different databases. If you want more control of the database, you can instantiate the database itself in your test, like I can show you there. And another approach is that you can create application integration tests, not just data access tests. For example, you can create your own container for Kafka container. You can instantiate a Kafka container in your test. But as a team, in the Shadow team, as I mentioned, what got our attention is that we can create our own containers, our own generic containers. So I wanted to show you how was our experience, our first contact with test containers and generic containers. So if you want to create or work with test containers in a project, you just need the dependencies for maybe JUnit if you want to use JUnit, and obviously in our case we will need test containers. You will need also like a normal library depending on what you want, but you want to make some REST calls. So in this case, I have this small class for that, and you will have your test itself. If you want to create a generic container, to be honest, it's really easy. You just have this class, and this is the constructor, and the constructor has a parameter, and the parameter is the name of the image that you want to start up. The other steps is kind of a build pattern here for configuring your test container is the same things that you will do with Docker Compose, if you are familiar with that. So you need to expose some ports, and you need to configure your container, and for that you just use this method with environment variables. And something also that you can do is attach a logger, because otherwise you will see just the log of your test. But if you want to see what is happening actually in the test, you might want to attach a log. And something that you should do is to set up like a health endpoint to tell test containers when the container is up and running. So when you run a star, this is kind of blocking call, waiting for this to happen, this actuate or health app, before running to the next line. So let me show you how it works. I'm going to run the test. In this test, what we are going to do is to start this test, and we are going to print the port of the gateway. With Docker Compose, you usually map the port to the internal of that container to the external of your machine, for example. But in this case, it doesn't work like that, because you don't want to fix the port, the external port. Maybe you want to run tests in parallel. So it doesn't make sense to have this port fixed. You want to test containers, create a dynamic port for you. So we have our test running. And now, as I said, we attach the log, and you have this view of what is happening inside your container, right? And those of the whale are logs from test containers showing you what is happening at the moment, like downloading the images, starting the images, those kind of things. But then you have the logs of your internal container. And if we have a closer look of what is happening, we have an error. It looks like we don't have a Eureka server. So our gateway requires an Eureka server. So we need another container. Let's add that container. Let me add it for you. if we want to add another container, in this case, our Eureka is the same steps. Just basically create another object for my registry is the name for our Eureka server, and to also configure the variables that I want. However, I need to, in some way, communicate both of them, right? Because I need to refer registry inside my Eureka. For that, inside my edge and my gateway server. That's why we need a kind of a network. So there is this network object that it does is simulate what will be a network. You can create as many networks as you can, and actually you can create like clusters inside your test. And we do that. We have some resilience tests using this concept of networks. And for that, once I attach my container to that network, I have to assign a specific alias. And with that alias is that I can refer to in other services. I'm going to run this, this test, but in debugging mode. I'm going to stop right here. The idea is that I'm going to start a registry that is my Eureka server. I'm going to start in my gateway, and I'm going to stop right before stopping my gateway. Here I'm going to print the dynamic ports that were assigned to each one of those services. Let me show you. Okay, so as I mentioned, and there was a dynamic port assigned to us. I have here a browser with our localhost and that port, and we have a Eureka server up and running. And there we can see that our gateway is registered in that registry. So we can see that they are communicating each other. So this is a way that we can create infrastructure using Java code for our test. But we are not testing anything in this scenario, right? So we are going to add some assertions there. So this test will have everything that we want. For this one, it's the same. Generic container for my gateway, a generic container for my Eureka. This time I'm going, well, I can run it. This time I'm going to start the server, start the Eureka, start the gateway. And I'm going to use my HTTP client to call my, my registry. I'm going to have send a GET request to the root and verify that that edge word is there. Basically, I'm going to verify this string contains this. Well, in theory, everything should work. But for recap, we have here the infrastructure of my platform running here in the test. I can configure in the way that I want, but also something nice is that I can run the test inside that, the actual test. I can run the actual test inside my JUnit test, right? So coming back to our presentation, I can tell you that that was our first date with TestContainer. So our first date, we could see that the configuration of my environment, like my services, my registry, my authentication provider, and my gateway can be in the same place as the test itself. Also, we could see that we can stop and start services. We control the network, and everything was using Java code. And something that we saw is that, and we didn't like, is that you have to read this. It's not bad, but maybe you can create some private methods here to refactor this test, but in general, it's not easy to read. We were looking for something else. But maybe the problem was not test containers. Maybe the problem was the place where we met. We met it with in JUnit Cafe. So next time for our second date, we met in Cucumber Cafe. So this time, I'm going to show you, because this is the moment that we discover how to create our tests in Backbase for our acceptance test. So I'm going to show you some of our tests. Okay. So with Cucumber, maybe you are familiar with that. Instead of code, you create scenarios in plain language, like this one, English language. You can use your language as well. And the idea for us, maybe this is not a correct practice in terms of QA, but for us was perfect because we could describe what was the scenario, what was the configuration at the moment of the test. Like this, like, okay, we have a gateway, but it's configured in this special way. And also we have the test itself inside the scenario, and what is the expected response that we wanted. You can go as deep as you want in terms of the detail of those steps. We have scenarios like this one where we wanted to be clear, like this is a feature that we have in our gateway to have kind of our rules based on the claims in the external token, if we allow the access or not. So we can describe those rules like this. And we wanted to have those rules in the scenario. Something about these scenarios is that our PO, something that is not really like technical, or as a developer can read the scenario and see if that is the expected behavior that he wanted. This is a way that you can describe something really specific in the scenario. And you can go further. I wanted to show you some of the most complicated ones, like this one that is zone affinity with Eureka. Zone affinity is a feature that allows you to have when you have different clusters, to tell your gateway if a specific node is not available, what should do, if move to the same zone of your registry, or move to a different service in another network, in another cluster. Those kind of things you need for achieve something like that. You need to control the services. You need to control in the same scenario that the service is up, that the service is down, and we do that with the test containers. Obviously, each one of these steps is backed by a specific configuration, and the configuration is the same that you saw in the unit test, JUnit test. But with Cucumber, we just kind of split those in different steps and make it pretty with Cucumber scenarios. So that's basically what we have in terms of our acceptance test. We added some tags in case we make some specific parts of the entire system that we note that they are not being impacting others. We just run some specific tags of Cucumber. But we release every month, and before the release, what we do is to create a report. And this is how it looks, a report for us before the release. And this is kind of the proof that we run our test before the release. showing what were the scenarios that we are releasing, showing each one of the steps. As I said, any business person can come here. Maybe not any business person, a technical one actually, because still he needs to understand, or she needs to understand concepts like technical ones, like headers, or in the case of, in some cases like asynchronous keys, should understand how the key rotation happens, those things. But in general, this is the way that we describe the scenarios. For us, it's also documentation, because we can see here what we support and what we don't support. In general, that was our second date, and that's was the moment when we got in love with TestContainers. So again, the configuration and the tests are in the same place. We can control the deployment, the start and the stop the services in the same place. Everything with Java code. And with Cucumber, we could create these beautiful scenarios that you saw, and the reports and the report that you saw. Well, the moment that we got in love was not showing those scenarios or showing these different configurations, but was like these moments when you change something really simple, like upgrading a library, and you think that everything will be okay, nothing will happen. And before you release, you run this test and you cut an error. And this saves you from a bigger problem. So that's the moment that you are in love of this kind of test. Another advantage that we have is that every time that a client has a problem or a user has a problem, what we do is to try to find the same scenario that he is dealing with in our test. If the scenario is not there, what we can do is to replicate the scenario of the client using just code. And if there is a problem and we fix it, we already have the test to verify that everything is okay, right? Something that I told you, we started with one scenario, one deployment, one configuration with Helm. At the moment, we have more than 90 scenarios, because this is not the only set of tests that we have. And this is growing every day. It's super easy to create infrastructure. It's super easy for you to create a new idea of how can you break everything. And because you can configure a gateway in multiple ways, you for sure those scenarios will grow. Something that I want to tell you is that you have to own your code. It's an advice that I gave you. It's what we did. We own our code and we create those beautiful tests. And now we have more time to play with cool stuff. Is it a happy forever? Well, I have to be honest with you. Some of the comments that we hear about our scenarios, one of them is that these scenarios take a lot of time to run. And that's true. 90 scenarios, that is what we have in this set of tests. It takes around 2.5 hours to run in a good environment. Is it a problem for us? Well, we release every month. We don't release every half an hour or every day. We release every month. So waiting 2.5 hours before our release is not a big deal. We had at the beginning the problem of Docker in Docker. Our pipelines in Jenkins were running with Docker. So if you want to instantiate a Docker inside Docker, you can't. You will have a problem there. But if you talk, we talk with our people, and they provide us nodes to run those tests. And lastly, our platform Backbase is moving more towards the cloud. That means that, for example, service discovery, I show you guys, using Eureka, right? But now, because we are moving more towards the cloud, we need something like Kubernetes Discovery. We are using now Kubernetes Discovery as a second option, right? But we can't test those things with test containers, unfortunately. And for sure, there will be more functionalities that will be more cloud native that we can't test with test containers. That will be maybe the opportunity for another framework, or maybe to talk with these guys in test containers to see what else we can do, maybe extend the framework. But for now, I can say that we are super happy with them. And that's it for my side. Let's see if there is some questions. There are some questions. Okay. So the first is, can I prepare Docker file for generic container, or I need to pull all the properties in a Java file? So you saw that, let me show you. So you saw that to create a generic container, you need just the Docker image. And this could be any Docker image that you have. So you don't have to prepare it in a special way, if that is what you mean. So if you have an image of an Nginx, for example, yeah, you can put it there and start a container. The second question is, does start on generic container blocking, or can be run in parallel? Yes, as I mentioned, it's going to block you before continue, because you need to know that everything is okay to continue with the test. So it will wait for this premise like that the service is up before continuing with the next line. I don't know if that answered the question. Let's move to the other one. Can test containers be used for testing microservices that are too heavy to run them locally? Yeah, obviously you need to have a good machine to run all the services at the same time. If you have 30 services at the same time running in just one machine, it's not going to work for you. In our scenarios in Backbase, we have cases where it's just 8, I think, is the maximum amount of containers that a test will have. But in theory, you shouldn't test like the entire system in that way, right? You can't just test some parts or some specific integrations. I don't know if that answered the question again. The next one is, why don't you use a Spring Boot rollback instead of test containers? I don't know, like maybe if you talk about like the data access objects, well, as I mentioned, the idea is to have to test with the database itself. So test containers allows you to test against an Oracle database, MySQL database. If you talk about like in our case, like these generic containers, the advantage is that you can test against the different dependencies and the reals one. I don't know if that is what you mean. Actually, I don't know this rollback, what it means. For the next one, would you recommend creating the environment for each test or only one file? Many tests for endpoints. Okay, yes, I know what you mean. So I'm going to show you one scenario. Okay, I think this could be the one. Yeah, so there are scenarios where you start, this background is going to run for every scenario. And that is really heavy, right? Because it's going to restart every one of the services. The advantage of that approach is that your tests are more reliable because, yeah, everything will be clean every time that it runs. But sometimes it's really heavy. We have some cases. Let me find some. Same. Yeah, can't find them, but yeah, we have some cases where we have a lot of tests in the same configuration. We don't, it's not another scenario, it's in the same scenario, but we run a lot of tests against endpoints before starting another scenario. But yeah, depends on, you have to find the balance, because if you run the same test again, the same configuration, maybe your tests are not going to be reliable anymore. Yeah, and the next one is, does integration of the test containers with Cucumber require any specific configuration? Not really. At the level of, as I said, like the test container is a library. So you just need the normal configuration for Cucumber, and in the implementation of the steps, you just use the library. So this is a step, and what I do is just use the library itself. So no special configuration. What else? Thus, only the user customer cases that depend on production are worth to write using test containers. Not really. Something that we notice is that you can start to be more creative. Like, we don't depend actually on the users and problems with the user anymore. When we talk about our components, we start to see, okay, we haven't tried this. So yeah, you can, I don't know, there is no limit. You can create whatever you want there. It's up to you how far you can go in terms of creativity and create more tests, not just the ones that the user or the problems that the user has. And the last one, if possible, how do you integrate the test containers into Jenkins pipeline? Or do you pre-run integration tests in other way? Yeah, so this project is a Maven project. So for our pipelines, it's basically just Maven command, just Maven clean install. And if we want to run certain specific tags, that is something that we do. Yeah, you just send the tags that you want to run with Cucumber. Yeah, that's it. And I think there is no more questions. So the invitation is to have a look to the webpage of TestContainers. It's super nice. I think there are a lot of plenty of documentation there, and have fun. Thank you.
Thank you, Fredy, once again for a presentation.